Have you ever walked into a room, a meeting, a boardroom, a political rally, and wondered, how did this person end up in charge? You look around and realize it's not a rare moment, it's a pattern. Time and time again, the least capable somehow find their way into the most powerful positions. Think back to history, Emperor Nero fiddling as Rome burned, or more recently, Elizabeth Holmes building a billion-dollar empire on empty promises. These aren't isolated mistakes. They're echoes of a deeper, more unsettling truth that power does not always belong to the wise. But what if this isn't just a tragic accident? What if it's built into the very fabric of how human systems work? Machiavelli, the often misunderstood philosopher of power, saw this centuries ago. And though he wrote in the 1500s, his insights cut sharply into the world we live in today. Because this isn't just history. It's psychology. It's society. It's the uncomfortable reality that intelligence, awareness, and virtue may actually be disadvantages when it comes to climbing the ladder of power. Why? Because the path to influence is not always paved with truth. Sometimes it's built on illusion, on the surface of confidence, on the show of certainty, not the substance of thought. The philosopher Socrates said, "I know that I know nothing." That made him wise and doomed. In a world hungry for easy answers, doubt sounds like weakness, complexity sounds like hesitation, and hesitation costs power. Those who rise often do so not by offering truth, but by offering simplicity, not by solving problems, but by pretending they already have. A bold voice, a confident promise, a refusal to admit uncertainty, these become currency. And in this market, the loudest bidder wins. This is where the wise often falter, not because they lack insight, but because they carry the burden of depth. They see too many sides. They hesitate where others charge forward. They ask questions where others shout slogans. In a paradox that would frustrate any Stoic, the very qualities that make someone a good human, empathy, self-doubt, nuance, are often the very things that disqualify them from leadership in the eyes of the masses. It's not that intelligence isn't valuable, it's that it makes the road steeper. A 2010 study even suggested that above a certain IQ threshold, leadership potential begins to decline. Why? Because those minds struggle to connect. They think too many steps ahead, and most people are only watching the next one. So we fall again and again for the performance, for the certainty, for the leader who claims, "I alone can fix it," even when we suspect deep down that truth is never that simple. Machiavelli wasn't promoting this, he was revealing it. He understood that appearances, not reality, often determine who gets power. And when systems don't check that tendency, foolishness doesn't just slip in, it thrives. In ancient Florence, Niccolò Machiavelli lived in exile, watching the political tides shift without him. He was no longer in the halls of power, but from the outside, he saw more clearly. He wrote not as an idealist, but as a realist. Someone who understood the brutal mechanics of how power really works. One of his most provocative insights was this: real intelligence can be a curse in the world of leadership. Think about someone you know who's highly intelligent, thoughtful, nuanced, careful with words. Now imagine that person running for office or trying to climb the hierarchy of a corporation. They pause before making promises. They see trade-offs in every decision. They ask hard questions. And while those traits make them wise, they also make them easy to overlook or even to dismiss. In contrast, those who rise quickly often have none of that restraint. They make bold claims without hesitation. They simplify problems and sell solutions with absolute certainty. And to many, that certainty feels like leadership, even when it's hollow. Machiavelli saw this early. Intelligence comes with burdens: the burden of doubt, the burden of conscience, the burden of seeing too much. In a world that rewards boldness over depth, these qualities can be liabilities. A smart person sees the consequences before they act, and sometimes that means they don't act at all. This is why, as Machiavelli put it, it is much safer to be feared than loved. Not because fear is noble, but because love is fragile. It requires understanding. Fear simply requires control. Research in modern psychology supports this uncomfortable truth. A 2017 study published in the Journal of Management found that intelligence correlates positively with leadership effectiveness only up to an IQ of about 120. Beyond that point, the relationship reverses. Those with exceptionally high intelligence are often perceived as distant, difficult to relate to, or overly complex in their thinking. The very traits that make them capable thinkers can make them ineffective influencers. This doesn't mean that intelligence should be hidden, but it does mean we must be aware of how society reacts to it. We live in a world that often favors the illusion of clarity over the reality of complexity. In the marketplace of ideas, simplicity sells. And the person who offers a clean, confident message, no matter how flawed, often wins over the person who carefully weighs the facts. So what do we do with this paradox? As individuals trying to live with integrity, with wisdom, and with quiet strength, how do we move through a world where shouting often drowns out thought? The Stoic path offers one answer. We may not always control who gains power, but we can control the clarity of our own mind, the alignment of our own values. We can recognize when intelligence is being punished and refuse to participate in that injustice. And most importantly, we can learn how to carry intelligence with humility, not to dominate, but to serve. Because in a world full of noise, a calm voice, even if it's not the loudest, carries farther than we think. There's a strange pattern in human behavior that becomes clearer the more you observe it. Often, the person with the loudest voice in the room is assumed to be the leader, not because they've earned that role through wisdom or capability, but simply because they sound sure of themselves. Certainty, even when baseless, has a strange power over us. This is where the Dunning-Kruger effect enters the story, a psychological phenomenon identified in the late 1990s. It reveals something startling. People with low ability tend to overestimate their competence. Meanwhile, those with real expertise are often painfully aware of how much they still don't know. The result is a twisted inversion. The most ignorant appear confident. The most knowledgeable appear hesitant. Shakespeare, centuries earlier, captured this in a single line. The fool doth think he is wise, but the wise man knows himself to be a fool. Machiavelli didn't need modern psychology to see this truth. He watched it play out in court after court, leader after leader. Appearances ruled, confidence conquered, and substance often ignored. Modern research confirms how this operates in leadership selection. A 2020 study from the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology found that overconfident individuals were more likely to be perceived as leaders by their peers, regardless of their actual abilities. It wasn't what they knew. It was how they projected what they thought they knew. Confidence, not competence, became the currency of influence. Consider historical figures like General Custer, whose arrogance led to fatal military decisions, yet who advanced quickly through the ranks. Or in business, tech founders who promised revolutionary ideas without fully understanding the science behind them, but who secured millions simply because they spoke with unwavering conviction. Adam Neumann of WeWork is a striking example. His business model was flawed from the beginning, but his charisma, his energy, his relentless vision, these were enough to seduce investors and followers alike. Even when the cracks began to show, the illusion held just long enough to raise billions. In Japan, Masayoshi Son once lost over $70 billion in failed investments, and yet, through sheer force of personality, he continued to attract capital. In Russia, oligarchs rose not through expertise, but through aggressive confidence and well-placed connections. These are not just personal stories. They reflect a deeper truth about how power functions in human systems. Confidence signals clarity, even when clarity is an illusion. In a chaotic world, that illusion becomes magnetic. But this isn't just about charisma or charm. There's a more systemic danger here. The overconfident rise, and then they build environments that reward the same traits. They elevate others who look and sound like them, people who won't question, who won't threaten, and slowly, competence becomes the exception, not the norm. This is how mediocrity spreads, not through malice, but through replication. The confident select for confidence. the simple select for simplicity. And soon, entire organizations, governments, or industries are shaped not by those most capable, but by those most self-assured. The Stoics warned us of this. They taught that true wisdom lies not in what you can proclaim, but in what you can endure, in how you carry yourself when no one is watching, and in how little you need the world to validate your worth. If we want to resist this pattern, we must learn to see through the performance, to ask deeper questions, to honor those who lead with thoughtfulness, even if they speak more slowly, with more caution. And most of all, we must find the courage to be one of them, to be steady in the face of flash and firm in the face of false certainty. Because while confidence may open doors, only character can keep them open. But what happens when confidence isn't just a tool for rising, but becomes a weapon for preserving power? Machiavelli observed something that modern psychologists would later confirm. Once in power, incompetent leaders rarely surround themselves with excellence. In fact, they do the opposite. They choose weaker subordinates, not out of oversight, but by design. The first method for estimating the intelligence of a ruler, Machiavelli wrote, is to look at the men he has around him. He understood that a truly insecure leader does not seek talent, they seek loyalty. And the easiest way to ensure loyalty is to choose people who cannot challenge you, people who owe their entire position to your favor, people who will never outshine you because they simply can't. This creates what some organizational psychologists now call a competence drought. Insecure leaders view capable subordinates as threats, so they promote mediocrity, reward sycophancy, and punish independent thought. Slowly, the system stops selecting for talent and starts selecting for obedience. Dr. Tomasz Chamorro-Premuzic, an expert in organizational psychology, describes this phenomenon as competence threatening. The more threatened a leader feels by the competence of others, the more likely they are to weed it out. And what starts as one insecure appointment cascades into an entire structure built on fear, not merit. History offers grim examples. Emperor Commodus, whose reign saw Rome sink into decadence, systematically removed competent officials and replaced them with flatterers and jesters. In modern times, authoritarian regimes often follow the same blueprint, surrounding themselves with loyalists who protect the leader's image, even as the country crumbles from within. In post-Soviet Russia, oligarchs didn't rise through expertise, they rose through allegiance. In Brazil's central political system, incompetence became institutionalized through networks of patronage, where positions were filled not by merit, but by connection. Even in democratic systems, this pattern can quietly take root. Have you ever worked in an environment where asking questions was discouraged? Where raising concerns was seen as disloyal? Where initiative was punished because it disrupted the hierarchy? That isn't just bad management, that's a symptom of institutionalized insecurity. In psychology, this is also tied to a concept called homophily, the tendency for people to associate with others who are similar to themselves. In power structures, this means insecure or incompetent leaders often hire others who think like them, act like them, and crucially, won't challenge them. And the result is not just a flawed team, it's a sealed echo chamber. Without dissent, without fresh ideas, without someone brave enough to say, I think we're going the wrong way, bad decisions multiply. The organization begins to rot from the inside, even as the exterior may appear polished and composed. The Stoics taught that self-respect begins with truth, and that truth includes the courage to welcome challenge. A strong leader, in the Stoic view, is not the one who demands silence, but the one who can sit in the storm of differing opinions and still act with inner calm. So what can we do when we find ourselves inside one of these structures? When silence is rewarded and honesty is punished? We remember that alignment with our values matters more than external approval. We don't betray our voice just to keep our position. And if we must walk away from a system that punishes truth, we do it not in bitterness, but in quiet strength. Because sometimes the most powerful act is refusing to become like the system we stand against. Even with this understanding, the question remains, Why do so many people still fall for incompetent leaders? Why do we keep choosing those who offer shallow certainties over those who offer thoughtful depth? The answer lies not just in them, but in us. Human beings are not wired for complexity. We crave clarity, especially in times of stress. We want to believe that problems have simple solutions, that someone has all the answers. And in uncertain times, the appeal of certainty becomes almost irresistible. This is what makes simplistic leaders so dangerous. They know, instinctively or deliberately, how to tap into our deepest fears and offer easy promises in return. Psychologists call this the need for cognitive closure. It's the mental desire to eliminate ambiguity and reach a firm answer, any answer. When people feel threatened or confused, this need intensifies. They become more drawn to black and white thinking, to bold proclamations, to the comforting lie that everything will be okay if we just follow this one person. In this state, nuance becomes a liability. Thoughtfulness becomes suspicious. And intelligence, once revered, is viewed as elitism or weakness. Look at how real experts speak. Scientists talking about climate change add caveats and ranges. Doctors discussing health policy admit the trade-offs. Economists forecasting the future speak in probabilities, not guarantees. Their honesty reflects complexity, and for that they often lose the public's attention. Now look at how populist figures speak. The message is simple, clear, emotionally charged. I alone can fix this. They are the problem. We are the solution. It doesn't need to be true. It only needs to feel true. This vulnerability is not new. Machiavelli saw it centuries ago. For the great majority of mankind are satisfied with appearances as though they were realities, he wrote, and are often more influenced by the things that seem than by those that are. It's a chilling insight, but it explains why manipulative leaders succeed. They give people what they want, not solutions, but certainty. In 2017, a group of Yale researchers ran an experiment that revealed something even more troubling. They asked participants to solve a politically charged math problem. When the answer conflicted with their beliefs, participants, even the most mathematically skilled, often got the answer wrong. Not because they couldn't understand the numbers, but because they didn't want to. Their intelligence wasn't used to find the truth. It was used to defend their bias. This is how smart people become complicit in the rise of foolish leadership. Not because they're fooled, but because they're invested in a certain narrative. Intelligence alone is no protection. If anything, it can become a tool for deeper self-deception. So what do? We slow down. We question not just others, but ourselves. We notice when we're drawn to an answer because it feels good, not because it holds up to scrutiny. And we remind ourselves that real wisdom doesn't shout. It listens, it reflects, it holds space for uncertainty. The Stoics understood this. They believed that inner calm comes not from controlling the world, but from seeing it clearly, even when the truth is uncomfortable. Choosing a path of integrity means accepting that reality is often unclear, that life resists simplicity, and that the people who promise quick fixes rarely bring lasting change. If we want better leaders, we must become better followers, not passive, not naive, but grounded in our own discernment, willing to stand in complexity without being swept away by the noise, willing to follow the quiet strength of truth, even when it whispers. Here's where the paradox deepens, because even when we see through the illusion, even when we recognize the danger of simplistic promises and hollow certainty, intelligence alone still isn't enough to counter it. Why? Because intelligence often walks hand in hand with morality. And morality, when facing power without limits, becomes a weight, a boundary, a set of invisible lines that cannot be crossed. For the thoughtful, the ethical, the self-aware, there are things they simply won't do. But for others, those same boundaries are tools to be exploited. Machiavelli saw this clearly, perhaps too clearly. In one of his most infamous statements, he wrote, "It is necessary for a prince who wishes to maintain his position to learn how not to be good, and to use this knowledge or not to use it according to necessity." To the modern ear, that sounds cold, ruthless, but Machiavelli wasn't endorsing cruelty. He was describing a brutal truth, that in a world of power games, the person willing to act without conscience has a tactical advantage. Think of Cicero and Caesar. Cicero, a brilliant orator, a champion of the Republic, a man of principle, ultimately lost to Caesar, who broke every norm he needed to in order to win. Caesar crossed the Rubicon. Cicero hesitated, and history remembers who took control. In our own time, we see versions of this everywhere. In elections, ethical candidates struggle to compete with opponents who smear, distort, and manipulate. In corporations, leaders who play fair are quietly edged out by those who cut corners behind closed doors, but smile brightly in public. At the University of British Columbia, researchers discovered something deeply unsettling. Individuals with psychopathic traits, lack of empathy, superficial charm, strategic manipulation, often rise faster in organizations, not because they outperform others, but because they're not burdened by moral restraint. They play a different game, and when no one calls them out, they win by default. This isn't just a Western problem. In China, the archetype of the ruthless businesswoman, the Shen, has gained popularity in popular media, representing a cold efficiency that wins at all costs. In Nordic countries, despite cultural emphasis on equality and collaboration, studies show that manipulative personalities still advance faster in corporate structures than their more honest peers. Game theorists call this a race to the bottom. Once unethical tactics are shown to work, everyone else feels pressured to adopt them or get left behind. And slowly, the rules change. Not officially, but in practice. That's how entire systems decay. Not through one great collapse, but through 1,000 small concessions, a bending of the truth here, a compromise of values there, until the people who still try to play fair are seen not as admirable, but as naive. The Stoics knew the cost of integrity. Marcus Aurelius, even as emperor, wrote about resisting corruption from within. Epictetus, once a slave, warned that the greatest chains are not on the body, but on the soul. To be free is to act by your own principles, even when the world rewards those who do not. So what is the answer? It begins with clarity. Understanding that the game is rigged in favor of the ruthless does not mean we have to join them. It means we must become more deliberate, more strategic, and more united. Being good does not mean being weak, and living with ethics does not mean living in ignorance. It means choosing a higher path, even when it's harder, because the alternative leads only to self-betrayal. And if enough people choose the harder path, something shifts, quietly, at first invisibly. But over time, systems change, not because of one dramatic act, but because more and more people refuse to play the fool's game. Not out of anger, not out of pride, but out of a deep, immovable commitment to truth. Still, the question lingers, how do we live with this knowledge? If we accept that power often rewards confidence over competence, deception over honesty, and simplification over truth, how do we not fall into despair? Machiavelli, for all his cold realism, didn't believe the situation was hopeless. He believed that systems could be designed, that environments matter, and that if we understand the forces at play, we can build structures that resist corruption instead of accelerating it. The Stoics, too, understood that we cannot always change the world directly, but we can choose how we respond to it. And sometimes the most powerful form of resistance is not revolution, but design. Not outrage, but architecture. So how do we build systems that reward real competence? It starts with feedback. Environments that offer fast, clear, and honest feedback naturally weed out incompetence. A surgeon whose patients keep dying cannot hide behind charm. An engineer whose bridges collapse doesn't last long in the field. In these domains, reality speaks loudly. But in politics, in corporate boardrooms, in media, feedback becomes murky. Consequences are delayed. Blame can be shifted. Metrics can be manipulated. In those environments, incompetence thrives because the system doesn't punish it. This is why the structure of a system matters more than the intent of its leaders. Germany, for example, employs a dual-board corporate governance model, separating management from oversight. This division creates friction, but that friction forces accountability. In contrast, organizations that concentrate power into a single unchecked hand become fragile, vulnerable to one person's blind spots or ambition. Another key is information transparency. When outcomes are easy to measure, like how many planes land safely or how many patients recover, merit tends to rise. But when success is based on perception or on narratives, appearances dominate. People judge more by the eye than the hand, as Machiavelli warned. The 2008 financial crisis made this painfully clear. Executives chased short-term profits, fueled by perverse incentives that rewarded appearance over substance. And when the system collapsed, it wasn't the confident who suffered. It was the public who believed them. That's the hidden cost of foolish leadership. Not just poor decisions, but erosion of trust. So what can we do in our own lives? We begin by examining our environments. Which spaces we move in reward truth, and which ones reward theater? Are we building teams that welcome hard questions or just easy agreement? Do our communities celebrate clarity or charisma? And we reflect personally. Are we complicit in systems that reward deception simply by staying silent? Have we let convenience silence our conscience? These are not easy questions. But Stoicism isn't about comfort, it's about courage. Machiavelli may have exposed the darkness, but the Stoics gave us tools to walk through it. We cultivate self-awareness, not just of ourselves, but of the systems we participate in. We practice alignment between our words, our actions, and our values. And we develop quiet strength, the kind that does not depend on praise, but on principle. Because while we may not control who rises to power, we can control who we become in response. And that in the end is where real influence begins, not in ruling over others, but in mastering ourselves. So where does that leave us? If the path to power is littered with illusions, if our systems are vulnerable to the bold rather than the wise, and if moral clarity often comes at the cost of influence, how do we respond without losing hope? The answer begins within. Machiavelli revealed the game. The Stoics remind us how to play it, not with manipulation, but with mastery over ourselves. Because while we cannot always change who rises to the top, we can change how we show up in the world beneath them. At the individual level, 3 practices form the foundation of resistance against the rise of the foolish. First, intellectual humility. This isn't self-doubt. It's the quiet strength of knowing what you don't know and not needing to pretend otherwise. Research shows that people with intellectual humility are better at evaluating information, less vulnerable to propaganda, and more open to growth. It's not flashy, but it's powerful, like armor against deception. Second, media discipline. In an age of endless noise, what we consume shapes how we think. Warren Buffett once said, "Really successful people say no to almost everything." Apply that to information. The Stoic mind does not chase every outrage. It filters, it chooses wisely, it reads deeply instead of endlessly scrolling. The goal is not to know everything, but to know what matters. Third, philosophical reflection. The Stoics practiced daily review. At night, Marcus Aurelius would reflect on his own actions, what he did well, where he fell short, and how he could live more in line with his principles. This isn't nostalgia, it's recalibration. Without reflection, we drift. With it, we steer. But this inner work is only half the equation. If we care about the systems we live in, our workplaces, our communities, our governments, we must also turn outward. And here too, there are 3 pillars worth building. First, accountability mechanisms. Environments that lack consequences breed incompetence. Whether it's an unchecked CEO, a politician with no term limits, or a teacher never evaluated, power without accountability corrodes. We must support and design systems where actions have real feedback, where truth matters more than presentation. Second, cognitive diversity. Surrounding ourselves with people who think like us feels comfortable, but it's dangerous. Teams made of mirrors miss blind spots. Teams made of windows see farther. In every system, from startups to parliaments, diversity of thought must be more than a slogan. It must be built into the structure, not for virtue's sake, but for accuracy. Third, radical transparency. When processes are hidden, incompetence thrives. When decisions are made behind closed doors, the unqualified stay in charge longer. From governments to corporations to families, we must normalize transparency. It isn't weakness, it's sunlight, the best disinfectant for deception. And overarching all of this, education. Not just technical knowledge, but moral reasoning, critical thinking, the ability to pause before reacting, to sit with discomfort instead of rushing towards certainty. These are not luxuries. They are the foundations of a resilient society. Because in the end, the rise of foolishness is not just a leadership failure, it's a collective one. It happens when we abandon thinking, when we reward spectacle over substance, when we stop asking hard questions. But the moment we start again, the moment we hold ourselves to higher standards and demand the same from others, the tide begins to shift. As Machiavelli wrote, "It is not titles that honor men, but men that honor titles." Authority means nothing without character, and character, while rarely loud, leaves a deeper mark. The Stoic path doesn't promise applause, it doesn't offer shortcuts, but it offers something better. A life lived in alignment with truth, a presence that cannot be manipulated, and a strength that no foolishness can overthrow. We may not stop every fool from gaining power, but we can stop them from defining who we become. And sometimes that choice, quiet, steady, unwavering, is the most revolutionary act of all.